October 31st, 1970. Margaret Abernathy, Peggy to her friends, Peg to Tom, stood before her bedroom mirror, her heart fluttering with anticipation. 1 year, one whole year of Tom Murphy making her laugh, holding her hand through Sunday services, and dreaming about their future together. Her fingers traced the empty space on her left hand where, if her best friend Nancy's hints were true, a promise ring might soon rest. The radio on her dresser crackled through Bridge Over Troubled Water while she touched up her makeup. At 20, she felt caught between the proper young lady her mother wanted and the independent woman she yearned to be. Tom somehow made her feel like she could be both. "Margaret," her mother's voice carried up the stairs. "Thomas is here." Peggy winced at the formal Thomas. Even after a year, her mother hadn't fully warmed to Tom, despite everything he'd done to prove himself. His recent promotion to junior reporter at the local paper, his volunteer work with the youth group at St. Patrick's, even the way he'd helped half the town repair their storm damage after last spring's tornado. None of it seemed enough. His Irish Catholic background didn't help. The Abernathys had been Methodist since they'd helped build the church in 1893. "Coming, Mom." Tom waited in the living room, 10 minutes late as usual, his hair still damp from rushing through a shower after work. He was chatting with her father about the upcoming hunting season, carefully avoiding her mother's disapproving glance at his muddy boots on her clean floor. Mr. Abernathy had softened toward Tom over the past year. It was hard not to like someone who'd spend 6 hours helping fix a leaky roof without being asked. Even her mother had grudgingly admitted he was a polite young man despite his background, though she still pressed her lips together whenever he called her Mrs. A instead of Mrs. Abernathy. "Hi," Peggy said, suddenly shy despite their year together. Tom's face lit up the way it always did when he saw her, that gentle smile that made his blue eyes crinkle at the corners. Her heart skipped. "Hey, Peg!" He reached for her hand, then seemed to remember her parents and pulled back. A strand of his sandy brown hair fell across his forehead, and Peggy fought the urge to brush it back. "Ready?" Her mother stepped forward. "Now remember, the Halloween festival ends at 10. I expect you both back by 10:30. "Yes, Mrs. Abernathy," Tom said with his choir boy smile, the one that had won over every mother in town except hers. "I'll have her home safe and sound." "And stay away from Lover's Lane," Mr. Abernathy added, though his tone carried more teasing than warning these days. Strange folks about on Halloween. Outside, the October evening painted the sky in deep purples and oranges. Jack-o'-lanterns grinned from every porch, and the musky scent of wet fall leaves filled the air. Children in store-bought costumes darted past with plastic pumpkin buckets, and Tom took a moment to compliment each one, making them beam with pride. In Tom's old Ford pickup, he reached over and squeezed her hand. "Happy anniversary, Peg." His hunting rifle hung in its rack behind their heads, a permanent fixture since deer season had started. The truck wasn't fancy, a 61 F100 he'd fixed up himself. But Tom kept it immaculate, and Peggy loved how high up she sat, like they were on top of the world. The seat still smelled faintly of the pine trees he'd helped her father cut down last weekend. She squeezed back, her stomach doing little flips. "Happy anniversary." She watched his profile as he drove, the strong jaw, the kind eyes, the little scar above his eyebrow from when he'd fallen helping old Mrs. Henderson clear ice from her walkway last winter. She tried to imagine their future together. Marriage, maybe kids, a little house in Millbrook where they'd grow old together. The radio played American Woman, and Peggy turned it up, letting the music wash away her mother's perpetual warnings and her own nervous anticipation. She didn't know this would be their last evening together. Didn't know that, in a few hours, everything she understood about the world would change. For now, she was just Peggy Abernathy, 20 years old, celebrating 1 year with the boy who'd stolen her heart with his quiet strength and endless kindness, while the sun set on what should have been an ordinary autumn evening in Millbrook. The pickup rumbled down Main Street, Tom cursing under his breath as he fought with the temperamental gear shift he still hadn't fixed. They passed Miller's drugstore, where they'd shared their first milkshake. Well, where he'd spilled their first milkshake all over himself, trying to impress her with a story about his latest article. The Gazette office window still displayed his most recent piece, Strange Sounds Spook Harper Point Livestock. though his editor had changed the headline to something more mundane about coyotes. "So," Tom said, glancing at her with that mischievous half-smile she loved, "where to first? Festival's got a new haunted house this year. Those kids at St. Patrick's worked pretty hard on it." "Not investigating more mysterious animal noises?" Peggy teased. She'd heard him grumbling about his editor cutting half his story. He shrugged, ears reddening slightly. "Probably just coyotes, like Mr. Hobbs said. Though—" He hesitated, then grinned. "Mrs. Jenkins swears it was demon wolves. Think the old lady's been reading too many horror magazines." Instead of turning toward the festival grounds, Tom guided the truck toward the outskirts of town. Peggy's heart quickened. This was the way to Lover's Lane, where they'd shared their first kiss last November. "I thought maybe," Tom said, his voice suddenly nervous, "we could stop somewhere quiet first. You know, before heading to the festival." "Thomas Murphy," Peggy teased, "are you trying to get me in trouble?" He laughed, but there was still that edge of nervousness. "Never. Just thought, well, anniversaries deserve some privacy." The truck turned onto the old logging road that led up to Harper's Point. The trees were dark shapes against the twilight sky, their branches reaching like fingers across the road. Fallen leaves crunched under the tires. "Did you hear about the strange lights people have been seeing up here?" Peggy asked, partly to distract herself from her racing thoughts about rings and promises. Tom nodded, shifting into a lower gear as they climbed. "Yeah, wrote a piece about it for tomorrow's paper. Probably just kids with flashlights, but—" He trailed off, squinting through the windshield. "Hey, what's that?" Ahead, through the trees, something flickered. It wasn't the steady beam of flashlights or the wild dance of teenagers with sparklers. This light pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, casting weird shadows among the trees. Tom slowed the truck, gravel crunching under the tires. "That's not normal." "Maybe we should go back," Peggy suggested, but curiosity hung with caution in her voice. "Just want to check it's not some kids getting into trouble," Tom said, pulling the truck to the side of the road. He reached behind the seat and grabbed his rifle, more from habit than any real sense of danger. "Won't take a minute." Peggy knew she should insist they leave, but Tom's quiet confidence was infectious. Besides, what could really happen on a Halloween night in Millbrook? They left the truck, the autumn chill immediately biting through Peggy's light jacket. Tom took her hand, his warm grip reassuring as they moved toward the strange light. The fallen leaves were damp under their feet, muffling their steps. As they crept closer, voices carried through the trees, low, rhythmic chanting in a language Peggy didn't recognize. The flickering light grew stronger, and now they could smell something burning. Not the pleasant scent of autumn leaves, but something chemical and wrong. "Tom," Peggy whispered, squeezing his hand, "I don't like this." He squeezed back. "We'll just take a quick look. If it's anything dangerous, I'll call the sheriff when we get back to town." They pushed through a final screen of branches, and Peggy had to stifle a gasp. In a small clearing ahead, dark figures moved around a bonfire that burned with an unnatural purple-green flame. They wore robes that seemed to absorb the firelight, and their chanting rose and fell like a tide of whispers. Tom's grip on her hand tightened. Neither of them spoke, but both knew they'd stumbled onto something that shouldn't exist in their quiet town, something that defied the comfortable reality of harvest festivals and Sunday services. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The fire flared higher, and in its depths, something moved. The thing in the fire twisted and writhed, a darkness deeper than shadow, taking shape in the unnatural flames. The robed figures swayed faster, their chanting reaching a fevered pitch. Among their alien syllables, Peggy caught fragments that made her head spin, words that seemed to slice through reality itself. "We need to go," Tom whispered, tugging gently at her hand. "We'll get Sheriff Tanner, bring him back." A branch snapped under their feet. The chanting stopped. Hooded heads turned toward their hiding place, and Peggy caught glimpses of faces beneath the cowls, faces she might have recognized from town if her mind wasn't reeling from what writhed in the flames. "Who dares?" One figure stepped forward, raising gnarled hands. The fire cast his shadow impossibly long, stretching toward them like grasping fingers. Tom immediately pushed Peggy behind him, his rifle raised more from instinct than any real plan. Everything in him screamed to protect her, even as his mind struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. "Stay back," he called out, voice steady despite his fear. The same voice he'd used facing down that rabid dog threatening the Parker kids last summer. "Just stay back." The lead figure laughed, a sound like dead leaves scraping across granite. "Brave Thomas Murphy. Always the protector, aren't you? Well, tonight there are things you cannot protect her from." Peggy's blood ran cold. They knew Tom's name. The fire surged higher, and the thing within it roared, a sound that existed somewhere between thunder and screaming. The cultists resumed their chanting, faster now, more desperate. "Run!" Tom shouted, raising his rifle. "Peggy, run!" The lead cultist thrust his hands toward the fire. "It's too late! The door is opening!" Tom fired. The bullet struck the flames. For one eternal moment, everything stopped. The fire froze like purple glass. The chanting caught in the 30 throats. Even the wind held its breath. Then the world exploded. The fire burst outward, but instead of heat and flame, it released something worse. A sickly yellow fog that moved against the wind like a living thing. Where it touched the ground, reality seemed to ripple and tear, and within its depths, shadows twisted into strange shapes. The mist reached out with tendril-like fingers, coiling and writhing with unnatural purpose. "Tom!" Peggy screamed as the fog surged around them. Her voice sounded flat and lifeless in the dense air. She felt his hand grab hers. "This way!" They ran crashing through underbrush, but the paths kept shifting in the unnatural fog. What should have been a straight shot to the truck became a maze of ever-changing trees and rocks. The yellow mist distorted everything, turning familiar landmarks into grotesque parodies of themselves. Behind them, the cultists' chanting had turned to screams that the fog swallowed and warped into something inhuman. Whispers filled the air around them, speaking in languages that hurt Peggy's mind to hear. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like voices carried from some vast distance. "The truck!" Tom gasped, his voice muffled and strange in the thick air. "If we can just—" Something moved in the darkness ahead of them, something huge. Through the yellowed haze, its shape kept changing, too many limbs and eyes appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist. Tom skidded to a stop, pushing Peggy behind him. He raised the rifle again, but what good would bullets do against something that seemed to be made of the fog itself? The thing in the darkness reached for them with limbs that shouldn't exist, bending space itself as it moved. The mist coiled around it like a living shroud, making it impossible to tell where the creature ended and the fog began. "Peggy!" Tom's voice was desperate now, distorted by the thickening air. "When I count to 3, run for the truck. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you." She clutched his arm, barely able to see him through the writhing yellow tendrils that surrounded them. "You have to." He turned to her, and in the strange light, she saw tears on his face. "Please, Peg, I love you." Before she could respond, he shoved her hard, sending her stumbling backward. In the same motion, he turned and fired at the approaching horror. The sound that answered his shot would haunt Peggy's nightmares for the rest of her life, a scream that seemed to come from the fog itself, echoing impossibly in the muffled air. "Run!" Tom screamed one last time, and Peggy ran. Behind her, she heard Tom fire twice more, the shots sounding distant despite their proximity. Then came a sound like reality, crumbling, followed by a scream that started as Tom's voice but ended as something else entirely, something that the fog seemed to catch and twist into impossible echoes. She ran until her lungs burned, until the sickly yellow mist thinned enough for her to see the lights of town below. The paths kept changing, trying to lead her astray, but somehow she kept going, even as whispers in unknown languages called to her from the fog. Only then did she realize she was clutching something in her hand, a small velvet box that must have fallen from Tom's pocket during the chaos. Peggy Abernathy fell to her knees in the leaves and wept, holding the promise ring that would never be given, while behind her, the hungry darkness continued to spread across Harper's Point,